remembrance we have to give thanks for our spiritual and physical blessings that you've bestowed upon us. Pray that we always keep that in our minds. Bless our time together today in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, today I'm going to title this Hollowed Out, and I think you'll kind of get a little bit where I'm going with that as we move through this thing. Just a reminder, some of the different platforms that we're on. We are, okay. Am I, don't know what that was, but maybe you left a tip. No tip. So anyway, some of the different platforms we're on, and we're trying to develop an app. Just pray for us because we're sort of all volunteer organization, and it takes a little bit longer to do these things than we would like. And also, if we could, we're also going to try to eventually develop an audio-only, more regular-only, audio-only podcast to protect some of you people who have bandwidth limitations. We understand that, and we pray that you would just be patient with us. And if you've volunteered to help with that, you might want to send me another email. I constantly, this is a struggle for me, just in one of my personal email accounts, and I have a number of them. I'm up to about 47,000 unread emails, and I deleted about 6,000 in the last week. So it's a little bit, so sometimes things, don't take it personally if I don't respond to an email that you send me, because I can't possibly keep up with all of that. That's in addition to what I still have at work and other places. So, but if you volunteer to help with an MP3 podcast, if you want to contact me again by email, that would be good. You can get me through the church email. There's an address on the website. We talk each week about the convergence of events, and it seems that even in a week when we're taking a lot of holidays here in the United States, that things continue to move forward with this thing. And this is my grid that I look at things. I call it the Prophecy ACLU: acceleration, convergence, logistics, and understanding. That as we get closer to this time that is prophesied, things are going to be happening even more quickly. And when we actually get into that time, we're certain that we're in that time. It's going to be really quick, going quickly. There's going to be a convergence. All these things are going to be happening at once. We also need to keep in mind, though, the logistics of some of the things in Bible prophecy that when it talks about a beast system that is used, we don't know exactly how that's going to work out. I think we see the foundations of that being laid, but there's a logistics there. And then there's also a logistics with regard to these wars in the end times, that there's going to have to be, people are going to be prepared for war. So we're going to see a buildup and a run-up of arms and that type of thing. And then as we get closer, we'll have an understanding, much like we do in the eye chart, that as you get closer to that object, things are going to be clearer. And as Daniel chapter 12, verse 4 says, the wise shall understand as we get closer, as long as we're paying attention to what's in the Word of God. So there's a lot of things. I've not talked much about apostasy in the church recently. That certainly is not something that we can ignore. I'm sort of gathering different pieces here and there to talk about that more. I'm going to recommend a book. This is, and I like the book because it aligns with how I think on the topic. And so a friend of mine named Seth Knorr has published a book called Apostasy, Rapture or Rebellion, where he analyzes what is really being discussed in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, with the term apostasia that's used there. It's excellent. He draws on, he's very good with Greek. I would term him a Greek scholar. And you can get that at Kindle. If you want to email me, I think I might be able to even get you a free PDF. I don't know what he's charging on Kindle, but it's modest. But I think it's very well done, and I think it's certainly part of, even if you disagree with Seth, I think you need to read his book and deal with the issues that he's raised. So here's some things we'll just sort of talk about, and I want you to pick up on the almost apocalyptic end of the world type language that we see coming out of the secular world. Everybody has an apocalypse, meaning that everybody thinks there's a potential end game. And so you just saw that with the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, Scotland, where the people in the secular leaders in the world got together, brought their huge carbon footprint to Scotland with their private jets and everything, and had meetings to tell everybody else how we're supposed to live because there's a climate apocalypse coming. This is a new publication, just came out, I think yesterday or Friday, from The Economist, which is sort of one of the publications of what we could call the Party of Davos, the people, the global elites who want to really set up a new world order. They want to do a great reset, and they want to get everything under their control. The Economist is one of those, and they do this thing each year. They do a forward-looking article. Sometimes the world ahead is the world in 2021. They usually call it that. This year they called it the world ahead 2022. And usually they put little clips, pictures on there as to how they think what's going to happen in the next year. It's sort of their prognostication as to what's going to happen. This is an interesting thing. There's an asteroid that's heading in the range of Earth. So NASA has sent up a rocket to try to divert its path. So that rocket launched this week. We'll see how that goes. It's anybody's guess whether they're going to be able to divert the path of this, but they certainly think that there are even bigger asteroids that are coming. But look, we know that there is this coming in the end times, and man's not going to be able to do anything about it. The interesting thing is that man thinks they're going to control everything. Man thinks they're going to control the weather and change everything. That's sort of a messianic God sign. If man is controlling the weather and changing things and trying to do all these things that really I think are the province of God, then eventually God's going to intervene. This is a picture of the area of Abbotsford, British Columbia. Beautiful area, about 30 miles east of downtown Vancouver. They've just had these massive, it was like a atmospheric river, they called it, that dumped just a tremendous amount of rain there in Vancouver and along the U.S. Canadian border in the northwest United States. The word is that this is going to affect British Columbia agriculture for some time. A number of the roads that connect, I think all the roads that connect British Columbia to the rest of Canada have been washed out. I think the railway might still be in operation, but this is only going to cause supply chain problems. Vancouver is a huge port. It's going to be difficult for them to get things in. And this comes on the heels of this is just from last fall, an article from the New York Times and elsewhere about a major drought that had happened in British Columbia. And here's what it says. In the last 6 months, BC, British Columbia, is both burned and drowned, so there is really no greater evidence of climate change right now than here in British Columbia. Now, look, when you make a conclusion that everything involved is climate change and it supports your position, you got to be careful making that type of assumption. This is a picture last year of the drought in British Columbia and the effect that it had on crops. It was bad, and now they have floods. This is going to, again, all these things will further exacerbate supply chain and food problems. We continue to have supply chain issues everywhere. Now the problem in a lot of the ports is that they're being overrun by empty containers. People bringing containers back, but the ships are leaving without the containers on them. So the costs have risen 10, 15, 20 times to use a ship to transport containers across the ocean. That's going to have an impact on prices. So now here's the issue. We now have another variant. Big surprise, right? Like we didn't know this was coming. They're going through the Greek alphabet. They say that, well, we could have a vaccine for this in 100 days. Well, what does that mean? That means more shots, more jabs for people. There's restrictions being put in place. Of course, immediately, not surprising now that once this virus variant was announced, supposedly coming out of Botswana and South Africa, that the health ministers around the world immediately blocked travel from almost all the same countries at the same time. One governor in the United States, the religious governor of New York, Hochul, who said that you have to do your religious duty and be vaccinated. That's what a good Christian would do. When she spoke at a church in New York a couple months ago, right after she took office, she's already put in place a state of emergency in New York. The name of the virus is Omicron. I thought it was interesting that a number of people said, it's interesting if you just change the letters around in Omicron a little bit, you come up with this. So since I spent some time putting that together, so this is Omicron really means moronic. And everybody's trying to comply with this. This had a huge impact on the markets on Friday, record loss, at least the biggest loss in the markets on one day for the entire year. Now, I think the stocks will come back because people just don't know what's going to happen. Are they going to shut down all the economies again? Are they going to close all the businesses? Are they going to ruin the businesses that they haven't ruined already? A lot of people are concerned about it. In Austria, they've put in place very severe vaccination restrictions. If you're unvaccinated, you can't go anywhere. I think you're allowed to go out and shop occasionally to buy food. But other than that, you can't work, you can't travel, you can't go anywhere, you can't go skiing, which is a big business in Austria. And there's a requirement that everybody be vaccinated, I believe, by February 1st. And there's a number of other countries who are on the verge of putting mandatory vaccinations for everyone in place, including children. This remains a subject where any dissent is suppressed. You can't even have a rational conversation with people about it. If their goal was to divide society, they've done a tremendous job on this. This is a protest the other night against some of the mandates that are being put in place in Italy. This is at the Circus Maximus area in what was ancient Rome, and they're protesting. The other thing, and so you see this sort of building of this world order happening on a number of different levels. You have the vaccination thing, which is tied to the virus, which is tied to the Great Reset, which is tied to the great narrative that I've talked about a couple of weeks. Here's an article from the New York Times, Decoding the Buzzwords Around the Climate Debate. They made up one of their little puzzles so you can go through and you can get all the climate buzzwords, one of which is ESG. And there's a company, now I'm going to forget the name of the company. Anyway, what they're trying to do is they're trying to take natural assets and bundle them into almost like a security that people would buy to control natural assets. And this is just another way for them to ultimately gain control of everything. So wilderness areas, water resources, areas that might have wind. They're trying to put those natural assets into some kind of asset class that people can buy and sell and trade. And it's just a way to make money. It's called IEG. I cannot remember what IEG stands for, but they talk about natural asset company. They're trying to get this approved by the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. It's just something else to work out. It's just look at or be aware of, as it is trying to bring more things under the control of the global elite. I mean, this has been a huge power grab on many levels. They try to control the narrative. One of the ways they control the narrative is just as everybody's starting to open back up, oh, boom, here comes another variant. Even though there's not any evidence as to how serious the variant is. In fact, some of the doctors in South Africa have said it's really not that serious. Then everybody says, oh, but those are young, healthy people, and they're able to resist the virus better, so we have to lock everything down for everybody else. So here we go again. By the way, this is the new normal. This is the new normal. We're not going back to the old normal. I don't think we're ever going back to the old normal. It's just something we're going to have to deal with. This is kind of an interesting thing, the Biden administration. By the way, I've used the term Biden administration for quite some time. I was watching Tucker Carlson the other night. He was interviewing Brit Hume. And Brit Hume was talking about, he says, yeah, you know, those people in the Biden administration. He actually said that. Now, the graphic down below said Biden administration, but I backed the recording up, and he said Biden administration. So another one, welcome to the Biden club. We want to welcome him, and it would give him honorary member status. In fact, we might even make him the honorary president of the Biden administration. People who use Biden administration fan club. But this is kind of interesting. This is, so what did Biden do when they first came into office? The first thing they did was they shut down the Keystone Pipeline. And they said, well, the Keystone Pipeline wasn't done yet. Well, yeah, it wasn't done yet because you guys keep shutting it down. It would have gotten done, and it would have helped get oil and gas out of Canada to refineries in the United States, so it could be refined into a product that could be used. They've shut down a lot of drilling in different places. And so now the Biden administration comes in and says, well, gas prices have gone up. And they're just shocked, and so they want to launch and invest. They want the Federal Trade Commission, to investigate, why have prices gone up? Well, you know, now the other thing that he's doing is he's releasing strategic oil reserves. And this is strategic oil reserves that are supposed to be there in the case of war, when we might not be able to get oil and gas from overseas. It's there to protect our military to be able to use those resources in a fight. And you all remember 1973, 1974, the gas crisis. I remember a few friends and I, one of my friends his parents had an RV, and they let 3 freshmen and 3 sophomore college guys drive that to Florida for spring break. And I remember on the way down, you know, we were budgeting, we didn't have much money, and we were budgeting, and gas prices had hit 50 cents a gallon. It was just a shocking price. But I remember before that, I can remember seeing my father buy gas for 17, 18, 19 cents a gallon. That's not out of, at least in my history, the time I was a child. So, but this is, I think, an acknowledgement of the Biden administration that supply and demand is actually the way things work. Because we'll release stuff from the strategic oil reserve, that will increase the supply, that will drop the price. Ignoring the fact that they were the ones who cut off the supply since they started. We were energy independent in the United States. And I saw a comment, something to the effect that, you notice they haven't demanded an investigation of the people who have wind and solar farms why they aren't producing more energy. They're only going after the oil companies. And this fantasy that we're going to get rid of oil, carbon, coal, and that type of thing anytime soon is a fantasy. I mean, it's nonsense. I mean, look, you want Africa to develop. You want Africa to have the comforts of life that we have around here and other parts of the world. They're not going to do that without fossil fuels. It's just fossil fuels. It's just not going to happen without those things. Now, there is maybe kind of sort of a bit of good news with regard to the nomination of Sally Omarova, the Kazakhstan-born in the old Soviet Union person who the Biden administration nominated to be the comptroller of the currency. Really, someone in her writing who wanted to be the controller of the economy. It's interesting. I was reading an editorial article on the Los Angeles Times talking about just the horrible treatment that she's received, where people are actually questioning her over things that she's written and said she believes in. It's just not fair. You know, she's not that bad. And again, this is another example of the gaslighting that takes place. That they sit there and they constantly tell you that what you're seeing is not what you are actually seeing. You're just imagining it. Well, we're not imagining this. And I love Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, who's Oxford trained, by the way. And the Los Angeles Times says he does that Southern Gomer Pyle thing, you know, oh, gee, golly, ma'am. And he said to her, he said, I don't know whether to call you professor or comrade. And so this is an article I saw this morning. Comrade down, Senate forces Biden to dump OCC nominee, a Lenin scholar. Now listen, there are reports that 5 middle center Democrats in the Senate have said that they will not support her nomination. That would mean that she would not get the votes. Even with Mitch McConnell running the Republican side, she probably would not get the votes. But I have not seen a formal notice that they've withdrawn her nomination. It may be out there and I just haven't seen it. So I'm just going to say is keep fighting this, guys in the Senate, until she's actually formally withdrawn. Because you cannot let up. Because in this sense, if you just let up a little bit, they'll try to ram her through. And who knows what they could do to get those 5 senators to flip on this and to put her into place. And she just wants to completely change the banking system. And look, there's things that we don't like about the banking system, but what she would do is the thing that I don't like is she wants to essentially have her eyes or her people's eyes in everything that you do. Just like they're hiring all these IRS agents to look over people. They want to track everything in your account over $600. Like, okay. So like they want to know when you pay your monthly utility bill or mortgage or whatever that might be in excess of $600, or you get a deposit over $600. It's very intrusive, and the reason they're doing it is because they want to control everything. This is an article in The Federalist that I think you should pay attention to. As the title says, in case with global implications, Finland puts Christians on trial for their faith. There are 2 people, a pastor and a member of the Finnish parliament, that are being tried because they have engaged in hate speech. Now, there are some recent tweets, I think, from the member of parliament, Pavi Rasanen, and I've talked about her in the past. She has said that homosexuality is not compatible with what God has laid out in the Bible. And she's an evangelical Lutheran, not in the sense that the evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is completely apostate. But part of this is a problem is that back in 2004, this member of parliament, she published this pamphlet called Male and Female, He Created Them. That's there's an English translation. You can download it, and it goes through the scriptures. And where she got in trouble was she had actually most recently, so that was published in 2004. And then last year she published a tweet where she quoted from Romans chapter 1. So now she has been charged with a hate crime for both the tweet quoting Romans chapter 1. She just put a picture of it, the Finnish translation of that passage of scripture, and a tweet that she sent out, and this publication from 2004. The hate law, though, was not enacted in Sweden until about 2007 or 8. So in other words, she's being charged with a crime for this pamphlet that was published before there was a hate law, and for publishing a quote from scripture which we know pre-existed the Finnish statute. And the Finnish authorities don't care. And if they get away with this, trust me, they're going to try this everywhere. It's interesting that this morning, I'm pretty sure it was this morning's New York Times, had an article that was criticizing how children are being treated by psychologists when they come with questions about their gender. And even this editorial, this opinion piece in the New York Times says that it's a mistake to just automatically to do the affirmation. Okay, you're a boy, you think you're a girl, we're going to support you in that transition, your biological transition, as opposed to is this really something the child wants to do? So even sometimes the New York Times gets it correct. The other thing I should have mentioned this last week, we talked a lot about the metaverse. I did a couple shows on Minute to Midnight. I think one has been posted. It's on Rumble. There's a little intro on YouTube, but because of the things we talk about, you can't put it on YouTube. So you can get the full show at Minute to Midnight Rumble channel. But we also did one where we talked more about the metaverse and this thing that Facebook wants to do. And and again, drive out New Albany and go down, I think it's Beach Road, and see the giant Facebook server farm that's down there. Now, my understanding is they're going to build a 6th building out there. There's 5. And the 6th building, I'm told, is going to be dedicated to artificial intelligence. And this is what they want to do. They want to create this alternative reality. So there are some people, Patrick Wood at Technocracy News has been covering it, Joe Allen at Singularity Weekly. He also is on the Pandemic War Room podcast on a regular basis talking about these issues. But one of these conferences, they have these conferences, and they talk about how they're going to change reality, where they're going to create this artificial reality. Well, recently, one of those conferences on October 23rd took place at the Vatican. Now, when it was first posted, I could not find, and I think Joe Allen said in a program I heard recently, could not find anything to really verify that this was not a joke or something that somebody had made up. I have now found and downloaded the video. You can look at Code to the Metaverse at the Vatican, and you can find the video, and it's about 2 hours, 15 minutes long, where they talk about this. It's just interesting. This happened at the Vatican Lateran Pontifical College, which is in Rome. It's known as the Pope's University. There are a number of pontifical colleges and universities around the world Or it used to be only one in the United States, which is the Josephinium over here in Worthington on Route 23, sponsored directly by the Pope, the Pontiff of the Church of Rome. And the one in Rome, the Grand Chancellor, is also known as the Lateran Pontifical College, is known as the Vicar General to the Holy Father for the Diocese of Rome. So this is a pretty big deal. So they had this meeting about the metaverse. They talked about this, what they want to do, augmented reality. And the reason they held it at the Vatican, and they held one a few years ago, is that they were talking about the spiritual dimension to this thing. This article also came out this week at CNBC that Apple is going to launch glasses next year in 2022 that will be as powerful as a MacBook. And what they're going to do is, my understanding is it's going to be tied to, sort of like an Apple Watch is tied to your iPhone or computer. It's not going to be a standalone computer, but it's going to be sort of tied into other Apple products. So you can spend more money with Apple, which is the most highly capitalized company on the planet. But in an article on Digital Trends, it says, "What is the metaverse? A deep dive into the future of the internet." This was just published on Tuesday at Digital Trends. And I'll just read this paragraph or two, because they're talking about virtual reality. What is the difference between virtual reality and the metaverse? And they say virtual reality, VR, and augmented reality, AR, are both concepts that are closely tied to the metaverse, but they are not one and the same. Instead of viewing them as different iterations of what is essentially the same thing, it's good to view them as separate entities that supplement each other. Virtual reality and augmented reality equipment allows the user to immerse themselves in a virtual world. In the case of virtual reality, we are shown completely different surroundings. Be it a game or movie, VR lets you interact with the changing world around you. Augmented reality, on the other hand, adds elements to your real surroundings and lets you interact with them in various ways. So this is a problem, is what happens when people are so immersed in this world. And the metaverse has been around in small portions in certain areas for a while. You have these virtual reality games. Now I'm trying to come up with the name that I'm trying to think about. Very popular game. They actually have intercollegiate teams that engage in, they have scholarships. Ashland University up the road was the first college in the United States to offer a scholarship for what they call esports. The first one. And so now you can get a scholarship for playing virtual reality games. So these are, and I think there's this desire to make everything virtual reality. Well, then the augmented reality is you're seeing what's in the real world, but they're putting things into the real world. What happens when people can't distinguish between the fake world and the real world? This has huge behavioral, psychological, and religious dimensions to it that have end times written all over them, as far as I'm concerned. This is very troubling. And there is a spiritual dimension to this. This article appeared online at the New York Times the other day. Space Pagans and Smartphone Witches, where tech meets mysticism. And this is what they say: the internet allows us to discover, select, and combine the spiritual traditions that suit us best. And a new exhibition, this is in Germany, artists are exploring the connections between ancient beliefs and futuristic systems. And here's a picture of one of the displays at this place in Germany that's doing this. And here's another one of the art pieces that they have. And you can So when people say it's just a video game, it's not just a video game. It's a whole mysticism, mystical religion. And we've talked here a lot about mysticism in the church, the ancient ways of mysticism that have made their ways into the evangelical church over the years. It is wrong. It is a heresy. It really undermines the truth of the Word of God. It makes everything experiential. So in a postmodern world where your experience is what truth is, not what objective truth is, this is very problematic, and this has a huge religious component to it. Now, let's talk about first the Rittenhouse verdict. We talked a little bit about this last week. Tucker Carlson did do a great interview with Kyle Rittenhouse. It is amazing to me that despite the verdict, people are denying it. People are still calling him a white supremacist, vigilante, just making up lies about him over and over again. This is part of the world that we live in. So here's the Global Times, which is the Chinese government's mouthpiece. And it says here, Rittenhouse case exposes the illness of U.S. democracy. And what's that is that we're so divided. How are we going to ever get anything done? And so China, Russia, other people, they look at the United States, they see how divided we are, and they're not that concerned about us ever opposing them in anything. I mean, can you imagine in this if China decided to invade Taiwan? Do you know that there were 18 war games that were done in the United States military about battling China? And the U.S. military in those war games lost every one. That ought to be concerning to people. China has none of our best interests at heart. So here's and you can find these very easily. If you look around, here is from the chancellor and president at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Now, you know that they're crazy people, and they're very wonderful people in Santa Cruz. Okay, but this university there is an insane asylum. And so they came out with a statement on the not guilty verdict of the Rittenhouse trial. So despite the trial, they say, we understand that you're upset with this, and that's fine. But the problem is that if you're in that university system as a student or a faculty member, and you say that you agree with the Rittenhouse verdict or that justice was done, you could get expelled or fired. And this is what's going to happen. Here's an article about units of indoctrination. A language arts curriculum widely used in U.S. schools ignores academic fundamentals in favor of radical pedagogy. And so as there's this dispute in American school boards, and there was an American mother in Colorado who was raided by the FBI just last week, who helped, as she said, flip 9 school board elections. They came, I believe they put her in handcuffs. They raided the house, took all the computers, cell phones, and everything out of the house. This is being done to intimidate people. Watch what happens to this person. If you stand up against us, we're coming for you too. This is all done for intimidation. This is the way things work. So here's what this article says at City Journal. Units of indoctrination. One unit in particular stands out for its embrace of principles inspired by critical race theory. Now, I've gone through the papers at this article at City Journal, published on November 24th. You can actually download parts of the language arts curriculum papers that are used. And you will see, despite the school systems, and this is used in about 10 or 12% of school systems across the United States. So when people come in and school boards say, well, we're not teaching this, we're not teaching critical race theory, baloney, you're lying. Now, you may not be teaching a course called Critical Race Theory, but you are implementing the ideas and concepts advocated by proponents of critical race theory in all of your things. Listen to this. One unit in particular stands out for its embrace of principles inspired by critical race theory. The opening pages of Critical Literacy, Unlocking Contemporary Fiction, meant for students in the 7th through 9th grade, explain that the unit will engage with, quote, the politics of race, class, and gender. So much for just reading the book, right? One activity asks students to break down hegemonic masculinity in the books they're reading. Another builds identity lenses through which students can analyze various texts, including critical race theories and gender theories. This is what the materials say. References to identity pervade nearly every page of the unit. Accompanying materials declare that the curriculum is dedicated to teaching critical literacies that will help readers investigate power. This is exactly what critical race theory was designed to do. And so it flows from its critical race theory or critical pedagogy is a sort of a framework, a philosophy of education, and then they build upon it by implementing it in classes. And so they're teaching these little kids all of this. Now, last Sunday, I think it was Sunday, we had this horrible act where this SUV ran down through a crowd of people in Waukesha, Wisconsin, in a Christmas parade. I think 6, maybe 7 were killed, 40 injured. Some of them were little children. Some of them were part of a group of older lady called the Dancing Grannies. And so it's interesting how different newspapers presented this. So it happened on Sunday. So you would expect, this is a pretty big deal, right? 5, 6, 7 people killed. There were a half a dozen in ICU and in critical condition on Monday morning when the papers were published. So here's the Milwaukee, Wisconsin Journal Sentinel, a horrible and senseless act. It's a big story. Waukesha's essentially a suburb of Milwaukee. Here's the New York Post, Christmas rampage. Here's the Wall Street Journal, front page center, talking about what happened. Here's from the Guardian in the UK, big full page article about this. The Financial Times of London had a big article on this. The Times of London had a half-page article on it with pictures. So you would expect, they're newspapers, right? They don't have an agenda. And this one didn't fit the narrative. He was a minority. He was out on bail. He was out on bail for having tried to run over the girlfriend or mother of one of his children with the same SUV just a few days before, and he got out on $1,000 bail. Some judges and prosecutors need to be fired or voted out of office. And this is what's happening. And so here's the Washington Post and the New York Times. Now, where do you see the article? Well, there's a reference to the article down in a little print down at the bottom of the page. Okay? Go to page A2 in the Washington Post, go to page A22 in the New York Times. So you got to dig for it. So here's what the New York Times said on the front page and then the article that they had. And it was an SUV who committed the crime. Don't mention anything about the driver. Why? Because it doesn't fit their narrative. So when I talked last week and week before about the great narrative, they're trying to make you think a certain way. Now, maybe CNN, I'm sure that's a big story for CNN. I mean, 24/7 news coverage. This thing is set up for 24/7 news, right? Well, here's CNN's page a couple days after the incident. There's an article about 27 migrants, I actually think it was 31, reported dead after a boat sinks off the French coast. Here's the Emmett Arbery killing jury verdict. Here's an article that Tucker Carlson added Kyle Rittenhouse to his pantheon of victim heroes, which again is an example of the left will always accuse you of doing what they do. Always remember that's like one of the most important fundamental rules of interpreting life that you need is the left will always accuse you of doing what they do. It's not mentioned on there. This is just a couple days later. This is from a 24/7 news source. I would be interested to go back and look at the CNN front page things for days, weeks, and months after the Kyle Rittenhouse incident in Kenosha, Wisconsin, not too far away. I'll bet they covered that for weeks and months. And here is an SUV ramming. I mean, it was horrific. I won't even show you the pictures of it. But a couple days later, what SUV ramming? Waukesha? Is that even in the United States? Yes, CNN it is. And this is kind of interesting from opposite parts of the country. On the right are people waiting outside a Nike store on Friday. And on the left is a upscale store in downtown San Francisco that's all boarded up because of the smash and grab things that are going on. It's just absolutely, well, we have a problem. We are really divided. I won't say too much about this. There is a lot of things going on in the Middle East, and a lot of it centers around Lebanon, what's going to happen to Lebanon. Lebanon is still in a state of collapse. The fact that it's probably already collapsed is just that nobody knows what to do with it. It's sort of like Syria. Everybody pretends that Syria is still a country. And Syria is not really a country. It's where what used to be the government of Syria has a little bit of land they control, and Russia has some bases, and there are rebel groups here, and the United States has some areas it controls, and Turkey controls a large chunk, and Russia sort of tries to manage everybody, and Iran has its militias running all over. And this the same thing as I think they're afraid that this is going to happen to Lebanon. It is and so there's a lot of concern about, Saudi Arabia is concerned about what happens to Lebanon. They don't really want Iran to completely take it over. They effectively control it through Hezbollah. There's also rise of units of Hamas. I'll talk about that in just a moment within Lebanon. So this all plays into this Middle East narrative and our concerns about what's going to happen in this part of the world. This is an article in Israel Hayom about Hamas. And Hamas, as I said, is moving into parts of Lebanon as well. So you not only have Hezbollah, you have Hamas. And they had an article, or they had a conference in Gaza recently where they talked about, what did they talk about in Gaza? What would they be concerned about? Well, they would be talking about making life better for people in Gaza, wouldn't they? No, what this conference was, I believe it happened at the end of September or October. They were talking about what are we going to do when we finally eradicate Israel. So all these people in the US administration and Europe and elsewhere who says, Israel, just enter into an agreement for a two-state solution. But here was a whole conference that Hamas had in Gaza where they say, they came out with a statement afterwards. Immediately after the liberation forces will publish a Palestinian independence document that will emphasize the Palestinian national identity and its Islamic, regional, and international depth. The committee's vision: immediately after the collapse of Israel, the security forces must get their hands on the data of the agents of the occupation and purge Palestine of these human diseases. Does that sound like they want to enter into a two-state solution? This is what Hamas says in its charter. It's never amended its charter. If you hear people say that it's amended its charter, they're lying. What was the title of this conference? It was called the End of Days Assurance Conference. It's also translated in some of these articles as the Hereafter Conference. This was an institution set up in Gaza in 2014, and they talked about, what are we going to do when we liberate Palestine from the Jews? And here's what it said. This is from Israel Hayom. Among other things, it is necessary to formulate rules for dealing with the Jews who will be in the country, including distinguishing between the Jews who must be killed and those who must be allowed to leave or be absorbed into the new state. The conference also called for preventing brain drain and keeping the educated Jews and experts in the fields of health, engineering, technology, civilian, and military industry for a long time, and for not letting them leave, and to register the agents and recruiters in Palestine. The conference's detailed summary statement includes 20 clauses, all of which outline the fate of the Jewish state. And you can go to Memory and find out, they translated it, what they're going to do. One quote from the translation: "It must not be lost, and we can use it to purge Palestine of the hypocritical human diseases that have spread corruption across the country. This important information will make it possible to pursue the worst criminals who slaughtered our people." During the conference, things were read on behalf of Sinwar. He's the military commander in Gaza, who said that the system of liberation and return to Palestine is becoming closer than ever. We already see with our own eyes the liberation, and therefore we are preparing for what will be after it. We are sponsoring this conference because it is in line with our assessment that the liberation of Palestine is at hand. A member of Hamas Political Bureau, Mahmoud al-Zahar, said that the apocalyptic system would be an enlarged model of the Jerusalem sword system that was related to the Operation Guardian of the Walls. So that's what they have planned. There's also this report. This is going to be kind of jumbled up because there's a lot of different pieces going on in the Middle East right now. China appeared to have been building a port in the United Arab Emirates. Well, they have they're part of the Abraham Accords with Israel, but they were building a container port. But as people were looking at it on satellite, it looked like it was a military installation, a Chinese naval installation about 50 miles north of Dubai. Look, this is part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative that they're trying to build. I've shown you inland ports that they've put in Central Asia, the largest inland port in the world. They have ports on the coast of Pakistan, near the entrance to the Straits of Hormuz that gets into the Persian Gulf. Iran also has a big port down there, and they're tying this all together. Now, they say that they've thwarted this, but I don't believe that it's really been thwarted, and they're going to be working on this, trying to get it done. Here's a report to Congress about China. I'll talk a little bit more about China near the end of this. U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, And so here's what they say. They're talking about, one of the things is, well, what about Taiwan? Any near-term the Chinese army invasion would remain a high-risk option. So right now they're saying, we don't know if China's going to invade Taiwan right now because there's a lot of risk associated with this. But they also say this: Given recent developments in the United States, this is from Congress report, it has become less certain that U.S. conventional military forces alone will continue to deter China's leaders from initiating an attack on Taiwan. A deterrence failure is most likely to occur if Chinese leaders believe that the United States is not militarily capable or politically willing to intervene, or if they interpret ambiguities in U.S. policy to mean that opportunistic Chinese aggression against Taiwan will not provoke a decisive U.S. response. Well, that's encouraging. Let's see, I'm going to skip over that. Again, this article, comes out of the Daily Mail. The Pentagon continues to be baffled about this Chinese hypersonic missile. And now it appears that not only is it a glide vehicle, but it can also launch a missile while it's in that state. So it's rattling along at 6, 7, 8,000 miles per hour, and it can fire a missile. We don't have anything that can defend against it. We don't have anything similar. And this thing can circle, and they can set it up and they can have it circle the globe and then just kind of glide down and do what they want. We do not have missile defense systems that can handle this at present time. But don't worry, the Biden administration has got everything under control. Now, there was a conference this week. The title of the conference was the Institute for Policy and Strategy, IPS. If you go Institute for Policy and Strategy Conference or IPS Project or IPS Conference on YouTube, you'll be able to get all the videos. They're all translated, and hardly anybody's watched them, but there were some important things discussed because there's really a lot going on in this space in the Middle East between Israel, Hamas, already mentioned how Hamas is viewing things, and Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas in Lebanon. There's a lot going on, and a lot of people are thinking, the way they're talking is that Israel's got a big problem because Iran does not seem to be going away. There was an article a couple weeks ago that circulated that, Syria had reached the point where they don't really want Iran around anymore. Russia doesn't really want Iran around anymore. Turkey doesn't really want Iran around anymore. But then Jonathan Spire came out and said, listen, and Jonathan is one of the best analysts on the Middle East that I know of, and he said, Iran's not going anywhere. I talked about that article last week. So at the conference, one of the people who spoke was Danny Gantz, the defense minister of Israel. He talked about the fact, here's an English translation of the article, that Iran tried to transport explosive materials to the West Bank via drone back in 2018. Now, this is something that has not really been revealed. Remember, there was a drone that was shot down, but it's now believed that what that drone was doing was trying to deliver explosives into the area of the West Bank. And so this is what Gantz said in his talk. Iran launched a Type 141 drone from Syrian T4 military airport that's been bombed many times. I think even the United States attacked it one time. It doesn't seem... So what do? We attack it, and what do? They rebuild it, and they come back and probably put in better defense systems each time. So it's kind of a moving target that gets harder and harder and harder to hit. It was carrying TNT explosives, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz said at that conference. Gantz added that his forces had intercepted that plane near occupied Beit Shan. And you notice how the Arab press always uses the term occupied Beit Shan, claiming that the plane was going to drop the explosive materials on behalf of what it described as terrorist elements in the West Bank. Gantz said this: Iran not only uses drones to attack, but also to transport weapons to its proxies, seeking to control and seize Arab countries such as Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. If you look at the map right now, what's going on in Yemen, the southwest coast of Yemen is pretty much in the control of the the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. That makes transportation in the Red Sea somewhat problematic because of the way they control it and the fact that they use drone technology all the time. So the drones may not have a huge range, but they attack airports in Saudi Arabia. Why can't they attack ships in the Red Sea? They're also making moves over towards Oman, over on the other side, the eastern side of the Arabian Peninsula, southeastern. It's very problematic. And so Iran is using drones for this. I talked a lot last week about the fact that drones. Now, what was interesting is that the New York Times had an article on Monday in its paper. It was Monday or Tuesday? Monday. It was a pretty big article. Iran rebuilds its nuclear centers, thwarting spy attacks from Israel. So this is all part of the narrative that the Biden administration is trying to put out there. Israel, stop attacking Iran. It's not working. You attack them, you assassinate this person, you kill this person, and what do? They just keep going. Part of the problem is we in America have a tendency to look at things in terms of the next election cycle or next week's poll. Iran has an apocalyptic vision with the people that are in charge. They believe they're going to bring about the end of times at some point. So they don't care whether it's now or 20, 50, 100, 200 years down the road. They're going to keep going because it's a religious thing with them. So for American to go to Israel and say, well, Israel, you just stop it. If you stop it, they'll stop. They're not going to stop. You have to continue to fight it. So at this conference, there was one panel with, on the left is the moderator, the second person from the left is a former IDF head. The next person is former head of the Mossad. So I'm going to just play a couple clips from the conference because I think what they're saying is important, and it just shows to show you the division in Israeli politics, defense establishment, that type of thing. They argue with each other all the time. They don't agree about policy, and you'll see that from the head of the Mossad. And one of the things that sort of came out of this conference, now that Netanyahu's not in power, is that, boy, Netanyahu was bad. He tried to make all the decisions. He didn't pay attention to us, and he didn't really do anything, and now we're in worse shape now than when he took office. Now, my view of that is it's just a bunch of baloney because you're seeing things happen in Israel right now. For example, there was talk about building apartments in an area around the separation barrier of East Jerusalem. And the United States said, oh, Israel, you can't do that. You can't do that. And Israel, well, it's Israel. We're in Israel. We're going to build apartments for Israeli people and Jewish people in Israel. So this morning I saw in the paper that Israel is backing off on that. They're not going to build those apartments now. Now, it was going to take a while to build them. Nothing gets sometimes quicker for people to excavate old things, and dig down and find out what happened thousands of years ago than to build something new. So here's a couple minutes, and it's interesting that this former head of the Mossad will say essentially what the New York Times said. Ex-Mossad chief Amos Yadlin. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm not going to play the clip because it'll take too long, but it just says this. Tel Aviv's policy on Iranian nuclear program was decided personally by the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu without consultation. The Iranian issue was privatized to one person, adding that the 2015 nuclear deal between Iran and 6 other countries, including the United States, kept the Islamic Republic from making meaningful progress in its nuclear program. This is just an ignorant statement. Here it is. there's an interpreter who will be interpreting what he said since he spoke in Hebrew.
The question is whether Israel has a strategy vis-à-vis Iran. That's the question. I think at the moment, at least, and the Prime Minister also said that we're thinking, we're talking, and as far as I see, there's no really consolidated strategy, but a few things that have been said recently seem to hint that we're trying to go back to something similar to what was before. So in the interview that Amos Gilad was moderating, between the Soviet Union and Russia, there was a long struggle. There's an interesting story between the Soviet Union and the United States, he says. There was like a war game that was held at a certain time, and there it was said that the two countries are conveying 100 nuclear missiles, one towards the other, and the American wanted to see what the result is going to be. At the time, the Soviet Union won over the Americans, although the Americans had much better missiles at the time, because the result of such a war that stopped a second before the world actually collapsed was that the Soviet Union came back from a world where people used to eat meat once a week, and there were a few big cities in a very bad situation, and they went from 1860 to 1840, whereas the United States went back from 1980 to 1860.
So do you understand what he's saying is they had a war game, and the United States was much more powerful than the Soviet Union, but in the war game, these Soviets, it's like, well, we were living in 1840 conditions, or we were living in 1860 conditions, eating meat once a week, and so we went back to 1840. The United States went from 1980 back to 1860, which was a pretty big shock to the Americans, and that's why the Soviet Union won that war game, even though they were less powerful, because they had a much longer-term goal in mind. Here's part of the problem, too, with Israel. I don't think it's discussed. I saw this in an intelligence report, is that we're 2 generations or so removed from the 1948 War of Independence. Israel announces independence in May of 1948. Immediately what happens is a bunch of Arabs, now later they became known as Palestinians, leave Israel and go to surrounding countries, mainly Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, in these huge refugee camps. But at the same time, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews who made Aliyah they were essentially kicked out of Arab and Muslim countries. And so you can see here some of the statistics. For example, Iran in 1948 had 150,000 Jews. Now they have 10. Syria had 30,000. 2017, they had 100. Iraq still had around 10,000, but that was only 10% of what they had back in 1948. And see these numbers. Oman, they went from 5,000 to 0. Afghanistan from 5,000 to 1. You understand what happened was there was this massive shift in population. Arabs left Israel, and Jews came back to Israel. Now, that had a huge advantage for Israel, though, in the early years of the Jewish state of Israel, because they had people who had come back from Iran who spoke Farsi and other dialects, so that it was easy for them to analyze documents that they might intercept through intelligence raids or spying or whatever. They could even go back, send people back to Iran as spies because they could speak the language. But now you're getting to be a couple of generations removed, And the problem is that the people who really knew Farsi and the dialects and other Arabic languages and their dialects are dwindling. And this is having an impact on the ability of Israel to conduct intelligence. Now, some people will say that it's not that bad, but there are people in the intelligence apparatus that have said this capability has diminished over time. And it's also interesting when you look at if you look at all these graphics about Jewish refugees from Arab countries, I could not find a graphic that mentioned Jordan or Saudi Arabia. I just found that was kind of an interesting hole in the data. The other problem is that, and this is Dr. Izzeldin Abulaish. He's a Arab, lived in Gaza. His 3 daughters and a niece were killed in Operation Cast Lead back in 2008, I think it was. There's some question as to what was the cause of it, because it appears that there's some thinking that an Israeli attack hit a ammunition dump that exploded and killed this man's children. I have no reason to doubt, as somebody suggested once, that his children were not killed. I've met him. I had dinner with him in Oklahoma a few years ago. And so he had a big appeal, and he just recently lost that. And listen, we're human beings. We have to be sympathetic with. He lost 3 daughters. He now lives in Canada. He's a doctor, gynecology and oncology, I believe. Very nice guy. I mean, you can sit there and talk to him. But he's been trying to get justice for his daughters, even though I think there are some questions. But one of the questions I asked him was, why are you upset with Israel in the refugee camps when the conditions of the refugee camps for Arabs that came from Israel in 1948 and their progeny, they're now 70 years down the road, they're still refugees in Arab countries. And you have places where you have these wonderful apartment buildings in Jordan, you have these wonderful apartment buildings in Nablus, and there's a refugee camp. You have beautiful places in Damascus, and there's one of the worst squalor conditions in the world at one of the most heavily densely populated places in Yarmouk, and within the city limits of Damascus. 73 years later, doctor, why are you not complaining to these Arab countries about the treatment of the Arab refugees from Israel? And he would just say, well, it's the occupation. So it was like you couldn't get through. And I was trying to reason with him. But this is part of the problem, is that they're using these people as political pawns. So here's another, this is the former IDF head who's also at this conference.
I talk about Iran on many platforms, but there's one issue that I don't talk about in open forums, and that is Israel's operational policy. We'll keep that in closed rooms where this issue is actually dealt with. I want to talk about strategy. Does the State of Israel have a strategy? What the Prime Minister said was that he was surprised to find that Israel did not have practice, that Israel had rhetorics. He was even more harsh than that. He said that we fell asleep at the guard post. I think that we have to manage a strategy using means that support that strategy, because when it comes to our relationship with the United States has the same strategic goal that we have. They also want Iran not to have nuclear bombs, but their strategy is diplomatic. They believe in diplomacy, and we have very little faith in diplomacy, even though, if we want to be honest, what postponed Iranian progress towards achieving nuclear weapons was the agreement, was the nuclear agreement, and not military action. That stopped them for about 7 years, and it would have stopped them for longer, because the fact that we fell asleep on guard several years ago was somewhat justified. There was an agreement. The international community had signed an agreement for 15 years. If they had listened to me, I would have said that the agreement isn't terrible for the first 7 to 10 years. years, as Gideon Frank explained why, but it was a terrible agreement in the past few years, and we should never have reached that point. So it makes sense to sit back for a while for the first few years and plan for the last years. So you're saying that the maximal pressure on Trump was a mistake. The mistake was not in 2015. The mistake was in 2018 when, after the withdrawal from the agreement, during its good years, we had to withdraw in 2028, not in 2018. So if you withdrew from the agreement because, like Amidwar said, you think it's a terrible agreement, and you don't agree with me, with my assessment that it was a good agreement for the first few years. The Iranians maintained that agreement, and they didn't violate that. We have to realize that they were stuck where they were. They were 2 months away from a bomb. They became a year away from a bomb. They sent the enriched uranium to Russia. They were left with just a few hundred kilos, and they were years away from achieving nuclear weapons. And that is much better achievement than we would have been able to make with military actions. But in 2018, after their withdrawal from the agreement without a plan B, because if there's anything you should know about the Iranians, they are smart, they are intelligent, they believe in strategy. They invented chess. They understand the details. They make incredible rugs. And we...
So this guy, it sounds like he's arguing with himself. I'm sure he's a very bright, intelligent guy. It was like, well, the first few years of the agreement are okay, so it was okay to go to sleep for a while, but then we need to have a plan B. And he acts like there was no plans. I mean, look, you can go look at report after report. INSS is National Security Studies Institute. They have a thing about the next war in the North, and they talk about this, and they say, it's not like we weren't doing anything. They raided the warehouse, for crying out loud, where they stored all this nuclear information. So it's sophistry to claim that there was no plan, there was no operational plan, there was nothing. And I've been following the IDF and the Israeli Air Force for a long time, and they always talk about the plans they have, and they're always adapting their plans. But he is correct. I mean, this is kind of an interesting editorial from the National and the United Arab Emirates about, the Iranians, they play chess. They invented chess, they say, and the Russians perfected it. And that's why sometimes we're at a loss to figure out what they're doing strategically. So this is, there's a huge problem here. And so the New York Times and the U.S. government, sometimes hard to distinguish between the two, come out and say, well, Israel, you shouldn't be doing this attacking. You should have lived up to the agreement. Everything would be okay. But even the former IDF chief says, well, wait a minute, in the latter years, the agreement wasn't very good. Maybe we should withdraw then. So you agree that withdrawal from the agreement is the way to operate. It's just a question of when and how are you going to do it. But it is true. I mean, the New York Times, so building on the New York Times, there's an article in Israel Hayom that talks about the assassination a year ago of the nuclear project promoter, Mohsen Farizadeh. And it was one of the people that, the Iranians, like I said, we have no replacement for this guy. They used to say, well, he wasn't really involved in the nuclear weapons program. But there was an interview just in the last 2 days by somebody high up in the Iranian government, which said, yeah, he was kind of the public face of it. The Ayatollahs didn't want him to develop nuclear weapons, but he had other people that he answered to in the government. So he had to supply, he had to placate them by developing these nuclear weapons. And it talks about it, goes into detail, and the New York Times did this about how his assassination went. Initially, there were reports it was an assassination squad. Then the stories started circulating that it was some kind of remote-controlled artificial intelligence machine gun that conducted it. Now that seems to be the narrative, the analysis that's carrying today, that it was a pretty sophisticated technological operation. All the people who were involved in the operation were out of Iran by the time the machine gun fired on this guy's motorcade in the suburbs of Tehran. He was killed, and then the gun exploded and destroyed itself. So when they got there, they just had a bunch of debris. So it was a very good operation. But the fact of the matter is, This is what the article says in Israel Hayom. The elimination of the man who played the Iranian threat to Israel has become a milestone in the history of military technology. While the assassination of Farizadeh was a masterpiece of excellent intelligence work, advanced technology, and exceptional field work, the world doubts whether the assassination, along with other attacks on the Iranian nuclear project, significantly distances Tehran from the bomb. And the answer is, it really doesn't. We know that. You know, the former head of the IDF just said, they play chess. So yeah, they send stuff to Russia, they stopped doing this, they hid their facilities. But the problem now is, here's another quote from the article. It seems that although the serpent head of the Iranian nuclear threat was decapitated that fateful afternoon, the body left behind by Farizadeh continues to shed its skin, upgrade, and become stronger all the time. In other words, the Iranians have replaced him. So Israel goes in. I've made many reports over the last months. This attack here, this unexplained fire here, this unexplained explosion here, this attack on a particular centrifuge place, which is going to set them back. And the problem is, they're like the multi-headed hydra. You chop off the head and they grow two and just keep coming back stronger. And this is what the situation is. There's a very big problem for Israel here. And so the question is, does Israel have the capability to go it alone and take out the Iranian nuclear program? Which current reports, I mean, here's a report from Project Syndicate, Richard Haas from just a couple weeks ago, not even 2 weeks ago. There is no reason to believe that Iran would ever sign on to a longer, stronger nuclear deal that places more severe constraints on its nuclear program for a longer period. Nor is there a reason, look, he's a globalist, he's a New World Order guy, Council of Foreign Relations, nor is there a reason to believe that Iran a decade hence will be not moving forward. The question is not if, but when we reach this juncture. In months if the negotiations fail, in other words, there has to be a war of some kind, an attack, or in less than a decade if they succeed. Are they going to get their nuclear weapons? And Iran allowed to field nuclear weapons or get close to such a point would likely be even more aggressive in its efforts to shape the region and its image. And so if Iran gets across these red lines, Richard Haas says, we have a big problem. And the answer is true. Iran continues to develop ballistic and missile cruisers. Right now, there's a lot of speculation among the foreign policy analysts in the world that Iran is within 30 days of having enough material to build a bomb and test a bomb. Their problem right now is delivery. Do they have the ability to get on a missile? But once they do, the whole thing changes. At the same time, you have these, here's Israel, U.S. and Israeli strikes in Syria in September to November. The sort of circular ones are U.S. attacks. These are ones by Israel. And so they're attacking certain things, but Iran just continues to plug forward. So without a big attack, which would lead to a big war, and the concern is if Israel does something too big, Iran and Turkey would get involved. But I thought Turkey and Iran didn't get along. Well, wait for that for just a moment. Here's Hamas positions that are being developed. No, this is Arab unrest in the Galilee region of Israel over the past few months. This is having an impact on Israeli society. And Erdogan, even though Turkey, the lira has plummeted, it's worth about 10% of what it used to be worth. People are getting upset with Erdogan. But Erdogan has been so clever in the way that he's structured Turkish society and government and the military. Used to be the military was a buffer against a leader going crazy. The military would do a coup. But Erdogan's purged the military, put his people in place. He's done this through the courts and other government structures. So it's difficult for anybody to get the political muscle and backing to take out Erdogan. And there's an election coming up in 2 years, in about a year and a half. But I will trust you, my guess is that Erdogan's going to try to change the electoral system, because he seems to do this every time he's in trouble. So even though they have problems economically in Turkey, he still plugs along with these big projects. I showed you a picture of that bridge across the Dardanelles Straits that they're getting close to finishing. Now here he is this week in meeting with leaders of the United Arab Emirates. They're trying to get along. I just don't think this is something that Israel wants to see. In addition, just yesterday, I'm looking for my graphic here. Well, I have hang on. Here it is. Here's a picture today of Erdogan meeting with Raisi, the leader of Iran. And they're talking about all the things we have in common and that we're going to do. So look, this is a difficult time in the Middle East. I'm going to refer you to what I consider to be one of the best articles. There should be a link to this in the description on our YouTube channel. Turkish Irredentism and the Greater Middle East, an article by this doctor at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. It's an excellent article. It talks about how Turkey has been at this expansionism for quite a while. They have this thing called the blue water country, I think it's called, where they're expanding. They've taken over parts of northern Syria. They want to take over more. They wanted to go all the way down to Mosul, but that got stopped. And remember this article, I've used this a number of times. This was in Yeni Sefek, a Turkish newspaper that is a mouthpiece for Erdogan. This was published on December 12th, 2017. And here's an English translation of it. A military comparison, Muslim countries and Israel, if the Islamic army were formed against Israel. And look, I mean, so we talk about Ezekiel 38 and this type of thing and people coming against Israel. And look at what that graphic in the Turkish newspaper, which you can still find online very easily, is doing. It's got military, and the article even goes on. I mean, it talks about how many people could come from all the different Muslim countries, that they would have an army of 250,000. It talks about it is possible to take action in a short time with 500 tanks and armored vehicles on land, 100 aircraft, 500 attack helicopters in the air, and 50 ships and submarines at sea. And then it says here, this is what Erdogan believes. Those who think they own Jerusalem today will not even find a tree to hide behind tomorrow. So I'm going to recommend this conference. Turkey's growing assertiveness in the Middle East will feature Jonathan Spire. It's going to be held on December 5th. You can go to, trying to remember, the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. So go to Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and look up for the conference on Sunday, December 5th via Zoom. It's at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time, so you can watch part of it and listen to Prophecy Update, then go back and listen to the rest of it. Or maybe you can catch Prophecy Update later. Don't miss Prophecy Update. But Jonathan is really one of the best analysts. He did a thing on Israel's problems in Syria recently that was just superb. I think that was back in August. Boy. Well, this is one other thing that I think you need to look at and kind of factor into this. This was a report on October 20th, 2021, the third meeting of the participants of the Moscow format consultations on Afghanistan was held. This is the Shanghai Cooperative Organization. It's a bunch of Islamic and Asian countries that have formed an alliance One of the issues was, though, before this meeting took place in October, there were certain countries that had observer status. Okay, so Turkey's not part of it yet, but Turkey's working on it. Iran has now been accepted into the organization. That's in the bright green. Mongolia is not in it. That's that other country. So understand that China's doing this to get these Islamic and Central Asian countries together. And what really unites them in the back, I think this is a very problematic thing. This thing has been around for about 25 years, but it is now described as OPEC with a bomb. Because why? Pakistan has nuclear weapons. There's some belief that some of the former Soviet republics still have nuclear weapons from the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you need to pay attention to this particular thing. And Caroline Glick has a great article. I'm not going to go into it right now. You can read it at her website, carolineglick.com. And she also has on her podcast, which was just released this morning, around the time church started. So I haven't had time to listen to it. I grabbed the transcript and looked at it a little bit. She has a discussion for about an hour with David Goldman, who's one of the better analysts on the Middle East. Used to write as Spingler at Asia Times. They're talking about China and what does it mean for Israel. And I would highly recommend you go and read this article. That's the print publication version of it, but you can find the article at carolineglick.com. Listen, folks, there's a whole bunch of balls in the air. There are a lot of people playing chess, and I'm afraid our country is playing checkers with one color. We're not doing very well. The world is in a so we have all these things going on. We have the metaverse, we have the Great Reset, the Great Narrative, we have racial division, we have this vaccine the state-approved treatment for Charlie Vector 019er that's causing all sorts of turmoil all over the place. Pray for the people in Australia and Austria and other places where they're shutting down. I've received information from a lot of people this week about people losing jobs here in the United States or on the verge of losing jobs. So it's going to be time, I think, for the church to really be the church here in the very near future. This is the new normal. Maybe that's what I should have titled my thing today, The New Normal, because this is the way I think it's going to be from now until I'm out of here one way or the other. I'm 67, so I don't know how long I'm going to be around. But I don't think it's going to go back to anything resembling what it was while I'm still here. I'm not going to see what we used to have in 2019. I just don't think that's coming back. So look, it's a great time to share with people the hope that we have in Jesus Christ and be the church. So let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the fact that you blessed us with information so that we could understand the times. We pray that you'll help us to take that information and not just process it as an academic exercise, so that we will act on it in a godly way, sharing the gospel with those around us and building up others in the body of Christ. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.